This document contains the complete tactical analysis and personal accounts of what became known as the bleaching of Kepler 438b, the single most decisive military engagement in recorded galactic history. The events described herein fundamentally altered the balance of power across 7 star systems and established humanity's position within the Galactic Confederation from one of mockery to one of profound respect, and in some quarters, fear. The central figure in these events, Commander Marcus Ghost Reeves, exemplified the ancient Terran philosophy that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. His transformation from a disgraced officer to the architect of humanity's greatest military victory serves as both historical record and psychological study of human adaptability under extreme pressure. All testimony has been verified through neural scanning and cross-referenced with ship logs, battlefield recordings, and alien diplomatic archives seized during subsequent operations. Section 1. The Mockery. The Terran Defense Force had been the subject of galactic ridicule for nearly 3 decades by the time the Kepler 438b crisis began. Despite humanity's technological prowess in certain fields, particularly in quantum computing and fusion technology, our military capabilities were considered laughably primitive by the established powers of the Galactic Confederation. The Zephyrian High Command had been particularly vocal in their disdain. During the infamous council session of 2385, Ambassador Kethvar Moore had delivered what became known as the soft pink speech, referring to humans as soft pink creatures who wage war with the enthusiasm of herbivores and the tactical acumen of freshly hatched larvae. The recording of his chittering laughter, accompanied by the harmonious agreement of the crystalline hegemony representatives, had been broadcast across every inhabited system. This mockery was not entirely unwarranted. The TDF's previous engagements had been characterized by excessive caution, overwhelming reliance on defensive positions, and a disturbing tendency to seek diplomatic solutions even when military action was clearly called for. The disastrous retreat from Proxima Station in 2384, where Admiral Harrison ordered a full withdrawal in the face of a numerically inferior raider fleet, had cemented humanity's reputation as the Confederation's most reluctant warriors. It was against this backdrop that Commander Marcus Reeves found himself stripped of his previous rank and assigned to what many considered the military equivalent of exile, command of the TDS Indomitable, an aging heavy cruiser with a crew that had been assembled from the dregs of the fleet. The Indomitable herself was a ship that perfectly embodied humanity's martial reputation. Built in the emergency shipyards of Luna during the resource wars, she was functional but unremarkable. Her hull scarred by decades of minor skirmishes and training accidents, her weapon systems outdated compared to the plasma cannons and void lancers employed by the major powers. The crew manifested the ship's character. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim, the executive officer, had been transferred after questioning orders during the Vega incident. Chief Engineer Roberto Santos was 3 reprimands away from discharge for creative insubordination. Tactical Officer Lisa Park had been passed over for promotion 4 times due to her aggressive tendencies. They were, in the words of Fleet Command, a crew of misfits aboard a ship of last resort. Reeves himself carried the weight of personal disgrace. Once considered among the most promising officers of his generation, his career had been derailed by a single moment of what Fleet Command termed excessive initiative. During a rescue mission in the Tau Ceti system, Reeves had disobeyed direct orders to withdraw, instead choosing to engage a vastly superior Corsair force to buy time for civilian evacuation ships. While his actions had saved nearly 10,000 lives, they had also resulted in severe damage to his vessel and the loss of 12 crew members. The court-martial had officially censured him for reckless endangerment and failure to follow lawful orders. The man who reported to the Indomitable in early 2387 bore little resemblance to the confident young commander who had graduated top of his class from the Terran Naval Academy. Reeves had spent the intervening months in what his personal logs describe as a systematic dismantling of my previous self. He had subjected himself to a rigorous program of physical and mental conditioning that bordered on the ascetic. 18-hour days spent in combat simulation, studying every recorded battle in human history, and what he termed strategic meditation, long periods of complete sensory isolation where he would visualize potential battlefield scenarios. His personal journal, recovered from his quarters after the battle, contained a single repeated phrase, written thousands of times in his precise handwriting. Weakness is a choice, strength is a decision. The crew of the Indomitable initially viewed their new commander with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. Here was another broken officer, assigned to lead a broken crew aboard a broken ship. What they could not have anticipated was that Marcus Reeves had not come to the Indomitable as a broken man seeking redemption. He had come as a man who had systematically destroyed every aspect of himself that had previously failed, and rebuilt something entirely new from the ashes. The transformation was evident from his first day aboard. Where previous commanders had issued standard orders and maintained regular schedules, Reeves implemented what he called perpetual readiness protocols. Every member of the crew was required to be capable of performing any task aboard the ship. The cook learned weapons maintenance, the weapons officers learned engineering, the engineers learned piloting. Traditional hierarchies were maintained for official purposes, but in practice, every crew member became cross-trained to the point where the loss of any individual would not compromise ship function. More significantly, Reeves introduced what he termed scenario saturation training. Every day, multiple times per day, the crew would be subjected to random emergency scenarios, engine failures, hull breaches, boarding actions, system cascades. These drills were not announced. They simply happened. A routine maintenance inspection might suddenly become a combat situation when Reeves would activate training holograms that would populate the corridors with enemy soldiers. A quiet meal in the mess hall might be interrupted by simulated decompression alarms. The crew initially resented these constant interruptions, but Reeves was relentless. Comfort is the enemy of competence, he would say. Predictability is the parent of failure. The physical conditioning was equally intense. Reeves had studied the combat capabilities of every major galactic species and instituted training regimens designed to match or exceed their natural advantages. The crew underwent daily sessions in variable gravity, combat in zero atmosphere, fighting while subjected to various forms of sensory disruption. Those who complained were given a simple choice: adapt or transfer. Surprisingly few chose to transfer. Despite the demanding conditions, morale aboard the Indomitable began to improve markedly. The crew found themselves developing an almost supernatural level of coordination and mutual trust when every person aboard can perform every critical function, and when every moment might require instant response to crisis. Traditional military barriers begin to break down. Officers and enlisted personnel developed relationships based on competence and reliability rather than rank. Lieutenant Commander Kim later wrote in her after-action report, "We stopped being a crew following orders and became something like a single organism with multiple specialized appendages. When Reeves gave the command, it wasn't because he was the captain. It was because he had consistently demonstrated that his tactical assessments were superior to anyone else's. We followed him because we had learned to trust his judgment completely." This transformation did not go unnoticed by Fleet Command, though their initial assessment was characteristically obtuse. Admiral Harrison's evaluation of the Indomitable after 3 months under Reeves' command noted unusual crew cohesion and above-average performance in simulation exercises, but concluded that the ship remained unsuitable for frontline deployment due to the unconventional training methods employed by the commanding officer. The Galaxy's opinion of the TDF remained unchanged. If anything, the isolation of the Indomitable from the main fleet reinforced the perception that humanity preferred to keep its few competent units hidden away rather than risk them in actual combat. This perception was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The Kepler 438b system had been contested territory for decades. Nominally controlled by the crystalline hegemony, it contained some of the richest mineral deposits in the known galaxy, particularly the rare earth elements essential for faster-than-light drive construction. However, its location at the intersection of 3 major trade routes made it a natural target for the various raider fleets that plagued galactic commerce. The situation had reached a crisis point when the notorious Crimson Fleet, led by the legendary raider Lord Vexstar, had established a permanent base on the system's 4th planet. From this position, they could intercept nearly 40% of all trade between the Confederation's core worlds and the outer colonies. The economic impact was devastating, but more troubling was the political precedent. If the raiders could establish permanent bases with impunity, the entire structure of galactic commerce would collapse. The crystalline hegemony had petitioned the Confederation for military assistance, but the major powers were reluctant to commit significant forces to what they viewed as a peripheral conflict. The Zephyrians claimed their fleet was engaged in essential patrol duties along their border with the Void Dancers. The Aquatic Federation cited seasonal spawning requirements that made large-scale deployment impossible. The Silicon Collective simply stated that the probability of successful engagement was insufficient to justify resource expenditure. In desperation, the Confederation Council had authorized what they termed experimental deployment of auxiliary forces. Translation: they would send the humans to see what happened. The official mission briefing was a masterpiece of bureaucratic condescension. Admiral Harrison, speaking via quantum entanglement communication from Fleet Headquarters, informed Reeves that the Indomitable was being assigned to conduct reconnaissance and harassment operations against raider positions in the Kepler 438b system. The subtext was clear. Go make some noise, gather intelligence, and try not to get killed too quickly. Your orders are to assess raider capabilities and report back to Fleet Command, Harrison continued. Under no circumstances are you to engage in direct confrontation with superior forces. This is an intelligence-gathering mission, not a combat operation. Reeves had listened to the briefing with his characteristic calm, occasionally nodding as if the orders made perfect sense. When Harrison finished, Reeves had simply said, "Understood, sir. The Indomitable will proceed to Kepler 438b immediately." What Admiral Harrison could not have known was that Reeves had been studying the Kepler 438b situation for months, long before the official orders arrived. His analysis of raider tactics, crystalline hegemony defensive capabilities, and the system's strategic geography had led him to a conclusion that would have horrified Fleet Command. The situation was not only resolvable through direct military action, but it represented an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that no one in the galaxy suspected humanity possessed. As the Indomitable prepared to depart from Terra Station, the crew could sense that something significant was about to happen. Reeves had spent the previous week in what could only be described as a state of intense concentration, reviewing every piece of intelligence about their destination, refining tactical scenarios, and engaging in long conversations with the ship's artificial intelligence that none of the crew were permitted to overhear. Chief Engineer Santos later recalled, "The captain was different during those final days before departure. He'd always been intense, but this was something else. It was like watching a sword being forged, all the impurities being burned away until only the essential metal remained. By the time we left Terra Station, I think we all understood that we weren't going on a reconnaissance mission. We were going to war." The departure itself was unremarkable. The Indomitable disengaged from Terra Station at 0800 hours, standard time, and initiated its jump to the Kepler 438b system. The crew had no way of knowing that they were embarking on a journey that would fundamentally alter not only their own lives, but the balance of power in the galaxy itself. The jump to Kepler 438b took 14 days, during which Reeves implemented what he called combat evolution protocols. The already intense training regimen was elevated to levels that would have been considered impossible under normal circumstances. The crew lived in a state of constant simulation, eating, sleeping, and working while subjected to holographic combat scenarios that could activate without warning. More significantly, Reeves began sharing his strategic analysis with the entire crew. This was unprecedented in TDF protocol, where classified intelligence was restricted to senior officers. But Reeves operated on the principle that every crew member was a tactical asset, and tactical assets required complete situational awareness to function optimally. "We're not going to Kepler 438b to gather intelligence," he told the assembled crew during one of their daily briefings. "We're going there to solve a problem that the greatest military minds in the galaxy have declared unsolvable. The Raider Lord Vexstar has established what he considers an impregnable position. Every conventional analysis supports his assessment. Fortunately, we have never been particularly concerned with convention." The crew's transformation during those 14 days was remarkable. The constant training and scenario work had created a level of coordination that bordered on telepathic. Orders were anticipated before being given. Problems were solved by whoever was best positioned to address them, regardless of formal responsibilities. The rigid hierarchy that characterized most military vessels had evolved into something more fluid and organic. Lieutenant Commander Kim described the phenomenon in her personal log. "We stopped functioning as a crew taking orders from a captain. We became extensions of a single tactical mind." When Reeves analyzed a situation and formulated a response, somehow all of us understood not just our individual roles, but how those roles fit into the larger pattern he was creating. It was as if he had rewired our brains to think the way he thought. The Indomitable dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 438b system on day 14, precisely as Reeves had calculated. What they found there would have intimidated any conventional force in the galaxy. the Crimson Fleet had established not merely a base, but a fortress. The fourth planet's largest moon had been hollowed out and converted into a massive weapons platform, bristling with artillery that could destroy capital ships at ranges exceeding 100,000 kilometers. Surrounding the fortress were no fewer than 47 raider vessels of various classes, from small interceptors to heavy battlecruisers that individually outgunned the Indomitable. More troubling was the intelligence that sensors revealed about the fortress itself. The raiders had not simply built a base. They had created a self-sustaining military installation capable of producing its own vessels and weapons. If allowed to continue development, it would become the nucleus for an empire that could challenge the Confederation itself. The crystalline hegemony forces in the system consisted of 12 patrol vessels maintaining a blockade at what they considered a safe distance, nearly a full light minute from the raider fortress. Their commander, a being called Shardsinger Veltar, hailed the Indomitable immediately upon its arrival. Human vessel, I am Shardsinger Veltar, commanding hegemony forces in this system. You are ordered to maintain position at these coordinates and await further instructions from Confederation Command. The translation software couldn't quite capture the crystalline being's tone, but the condescension was unmistakable. Reeves's response was characteristically calm. Shardsinger Veltar, this is Commander Reeves of the Terran vessel Indomitable. We acknowledge your position and will coordinate our operations with yours as appropriate. What Veltar didn't understand was that Reeves had no intention of awaiting instructions from anyone. The 14-day journey had been spent not only training his crew, but developing a tactical approach that no conventional military mind would have considered possible. The plan that Reeves had formulated was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Rather than attempting to engage the vastly superior raider fleet in conventional combat, he intended to eliminate the entire threat through what he termed systemic disruption. Over the next 6 hours, while maintaining what appeared to be a routine patrol pattern at the edge of the system, the Indomitable conducted a comprehensive sensor sweep of every significant body in the Kepler 438b system. This wasn't unusual. Intelligence gathering was, after all, their official mission. What was unusual was the precision and scope of the data being collected. Reeves was not merely mapping the raider positions and defensive capabilities. He was analyzing the fundamental physics of the entire system: gravitational fields, magnetic anomalies, solar radiation patterns, atmospheric compositions, and mineral distributions. More significantly, he was identifying what he termed cascade points, locations where a relatively small intervention could trigger much larger consequences. Chief Science Officer Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had joined the crew despite being overqualified for the position, later wrote, "What Reeves was doing went beyond conventional tactical analysis. He was treating the entire star system as a single complex machine and looking for the points where that machine was most vulnerable to disruption. It was like watching someone solve a three-dimensional puzzle that no one else even knew existed." The key insight that would make everything possible came from Reeves' analysis of the system's asteroid belt. Kepler 438b possessed an unusually dense and unstable asteroid field between the third and fourth planets, held in a delicate gravitational balance by the competing influences of the system's 2 stars and several large planets. Most military analysts had dismissed the asteroid belt as a navigational hazard of no tactical significance. Reeves saw it as a weapon of unprecedented scale. The asteroids in the belt ranged from small debris to bodies nearly the size of Luna. Many contained high concentrations of metallic ores that made them virtually undetectable to conventional sensors when inactive, but which would create massive electromagnetic signatures if subjected to the right kind of energy discharge. More importantly, their orbital positions were maintained by a gravitational balance so delicate that relatively minor adjustments could trigger a cascade effect that would send hundreds of these massive objects careening through the inner system. The plan that began to take shape was audacious beyond anything attempted in recorded military history. Rather than engaging the raider fleet directly, Reeves intended to weaponize the system itself. The first phase required what appeared to be routine reconnaissance flights. Over the course of 3 days, the Indomitable conducted what seemed like standard patrol operations, approaching various points of interest in the system, taking sensor readings, and withdrawing before attracting significant attention from the raiders. In reality, these flights were precisely calculated approach runs that allowed the ship's engineers to deploy a network of what Reeves called gravitational resonance devices, small, nearly undetectable instruments that could generate localized gravitational fields when activated in sequence. The devices were based on technology that the TDF had been developing for asteroid mining operations, equipment designed to nudge small celestial bodies into more convenient orbital positions for resource extraction. No one had ever considered their potential military applications because no one had ever thought in terms of warfare on such a massive scale. The second phase required the cooperation of the crystalline hegemony forces, though they were unaware of their role in Reeves' plan. Through carefully worded communications, Reeves convinced Shard Singer Veltar that the Terran ship had identified weaknesses in the Raider defensive perimeter that could be exploited through coordinated pressure at specific points. If your forces engaged the Raider picket lines at coordinates 347-221, 891 at precisely 1400 hours tomorrow, the anticipated response patterns should provide the Indomitable with an opportunity to gather detailed intelligence on their command and control systems, Reeves had explained during a joint tactical conference. What Reeves didn't explain was that the hegemony attack would serve as the trigger for the gravitational cascade he had been preparing. When the Raiders responded to the crystalline assault by repositioning their fleet into a more defensive formation, they would unknowingly place themselves in the optimal position for what was to follow. The third phase was the most dangerous, requiring the Indomitable to penetrate deep into the inner system, approaching within range of the Raider fortress's primary weapons. This was a maneuver that would normally be considered suicidal, but Reeves had identified a window of opportunity that would exist for exactly 17 minutes during the gravitational cascade. At 1400 hours on the appointed day, the crystalline hegemony forces began their assault on the Raider picket lines. Exactly as Reeves had suggested. The attack was fierce but ultimately futile. The hegemony vessels were outgunned and forced to withdraw after inflicting minimal damage. From their perspective, the operation had been another frustrating failure, confirming their assessment that the Raider position was indeed impregnable. Shard Singer Veltar later recorded his disappointment. The human commander's intelligence proved accurate regarding Raider response patterns, but the suggested tactical approach was inadequate to achieve significant results. The Terran vessel failed to capitalize on the opportunity we created through our sacrifice. What Veltar didn't realize was that the opportunity Reeves had been seeking had nothing to do with conventional military engagement. As the Raider fleet repositioned itself in response to the hegemony attack, moving into a tighter defensive formation around their fortress, they placed themselves at the exact coordinates Reeves had been calculating for days. At 1403 hours, while the Raiders were still focused on the retreating crystalline forces, Reeves activated the gravitational resonance devices. The effect was initially subtle. Throughout the asteroid belt, hundreds of small gravitational generators began operating in precise synchronization, creating interference patterns in the delicate gravitational fields that maintained the belt's stability. For the first few minutes, nothing visible happened. Then the cascade began. The first asteroids to break from their stable orbits were relatively small, bodies no larger than office buildings. But their altered trajectories affected the gravitational fields of larger bodies, which in turn influenced even larger objects. Within 10 minutes, the entire asteroid belt was in motion, with hundreds of massive objects accelerating toward the inner system. The Raider response was swift but ineffective. Their sensors detected the approaching asteroids, but the sheer scale of the phenomenon was beyond anything they had prepared for. Asteroid impacts were a known hazard in space combat, but no one had ever conceived of a situation where an entire belt would simultaneously destabilize. Raider Lord Vextar himself took personal command of the defensive response, ordering his fleet to engage the largest asteroids with their primary weapons. The tactic might have worked against a conventional asteroid storm, but Reeves had selected his targets with care. Many of the approaching bodies contained high concentrations of metallic ores that, when struck by energy weapons, would fragment into clouds of highly conductive debris. As the Raider fleet opened fire on the approaching asteroids, they inadvertently created massive electromagnetic anomalies throughout the inner system. Sensor systems began malfunctioning. Communication networks experienced severe interference. Navigation computers failed as their reference points disappeared in clouds of metallic chaff. This was the moment Reeves had been waiting for. At 1417 hours, while the Raider fleet was distracted by the asteroid barrage and operating with severely compromised sensors, the Indomitable began its approach to the Fortress Moon. The ship's course was precisely calculated to take advantage of the gravitational disruptions Reeves had created, using the altered gravitational fields to accelerate far beyond the vessel's normal capabilities. The approach was a masterpiece of precision piloting. Chief Navigator Lisa Park, operating with calculations provided by Reeves and real-time adjustments from Dr. Vasquez, threaded the Indomitable through a constantly shifting maze of asteroids, debris clouds, and gravitational anomalies. The ship reached velocities that should have been impossible for a vessel of its class, riding gravitational waves like a surfboard on an ocean storm. More importantly, the electromagnetic chaos created by the disintegrating asteroids rendered the Indomitable effectively invisible to radar sensors. The ship appeared on their detection systems as just another piece of debris in the massive storm that was consuming their defensive perimeter. By the time the raiders realized that the approaching object was actually a Terran warship, the Indomitable was already within the fortress's defensive perimeter, moving too fast and too unpredictably for their weapons to achieve a targeting lock. What happened next became known as the 17-minute war. Rather than attempting to engage the fortress with the Indomitable's conventional weapons, a futile gesture against such a massive installation, Reeves implemented the final phase of his plan. The ship's approach had been calculated not to attack the fortress, but to deliver a single, precisely targeted payload to a location that no raider would have considered vulnerable: the fortress's primary gravitational stabilizer. Every artificial installation built on or within an asteroid or moon required gravitational stabilization systems to prevent structural collapse. The Fortress Moon was no exception. Its massive weapons emplacements, manufacturing facilities, and docking bays had all been constructed, assuming that the moon's gravitational field would remain constant. The payload that the Indomitable delivered was deceptively simple: a modified version of the same gravitational resonance technology that had destabilized the asteroid belt, but configured to operate in reverse. Instead of disrupting gravitational fields, it would dramatically amplify them. The device was deployed not through conventional weapons, but through what appeared to be a routine exhaust vent operation as the Indomitable passed over the fortress's north pole. To radar sensors, it looked like the Terran ship was dumping waste heat, a normal procedure for vessels operating at high velocity in gravitational fields. The gravitational amplifier activated 60 seconds after deployment, beginning a process that would take exactly 16 more minutes to complete. The Fortress Moon's gravitational field began increasing exponentially, doubling every 40 seconds. The initial effect was barely noticeable. The fortress's internal systems registered minor fluctuations in their gravitational compensation networks, but these were well within normal operational parameters. The raider crews focused on the continuing asteroid bombardment and the mysterious Terran vessel that had somehow penetrated their defenses, paid little attention to routine system alerts. By the 5th minute, the gravitational increases were becoming problematic. Equipment began shifting in storage bays. Personnel reported difficulty moving through certain sections of the fortress. Automated systems started experiencing calibration errors. By the 10th minute, the situation was clearly catastrophic. The fortress's structural integrity was compromised as gravitational stresses exceeded design specifications. Emergency bulkheads began sealing automatically as sections of the installation started to collapse under their own massively amplified weight. By the 15th minute, the Fortress Moon had become a miniature black hole. The collapse was spectacular and terrifying. The Raiders' greatest stronghold, an installation that had been considered impregnable, simply folded in on itself as its own gravity became too strong for its structure to withstand. The massive weapons that had held the entire system at bay were crushed into neutronium. The manufacturing facilities that had been producing new ships for the Crimson Fleet became microscopic points of infinite density. The effect on the Raider fleet was immediate and devastating. Ships that had been maintaining positions near the fortress were caught in the intensifying gravitational field and dragged inexorably toward the collapsing moon. Those vessels that were far enough away to escape the gravitational trap found themselves scattered throughout the system, their formations broken, their command structure eliminated. Raider Lord Vexstar himself was aboard the fortress when the gravitational amplifier activated. His final transmission, intercepted by Confederation intelligence, consisted of a single word repeated in 17 different languages: impossible. The collapse of the Fortress Moon created gravitational waves that propagated throughout the entire system, disrupting the carefully planned trajectories of the asteroid barrage and sending the remaining debris into safe orbits around the system's outer planets. The electromagnetic chaos that had blinded sensors and disrupted communications began to dissipate as the metallic debris settled into stable patterns. As the cosmic dust cleared, literally and figuratively, the scope of what had been accomplished became evident. The Crimson Fleet, one of the most feared raider organizations in the galaxy, had been effectively eliminated as a fighting force. Of the 47 vessels that had been stationed in the system, 31 had been destroyed outright, either by asteroid impacts or by the gravitational collapse of the fortress. The remaining 16 were scattered, damaged, and demoralized, no longer a threat to galactic commerce. More significantly, the event had demonstrated capabilities that no one in the galaxy had suspected humanity possessed: the ability to weaponize entire star systems, to turn the fundamental forces of physics into instruments of warfare, suggested a level of tactical sophistication that redefined what was considered possible in military science. The Indomitable itself had survived the engagement with minimal damage, having completed its mission and withdrawn to a safe distance before the fortress's final collapse. The crew, who had spent 17 minutes watching their captain orchestrate the destruction of an enemy force that outnumbered them 50-1, found themselves struggling to comprehend what they had witnessed. Chief Engineer Santos later wrote, "We knew Reeves was different. We knew he was preparing us for something significant. But watching him turn an entire star system into a weapon, it was like discovering that your mild-mannered professor was actually a god of war." The man had spent months planning something that no one else would have even considered attempting. The immediate aftermath of the battle was characterized by a profound silence that extended far beyond the Kepler Ord 438b system. The crystalline hegemony forces, who had witnessed the entire engagement from their position at the edge of the system, found themselves unable to formulate an adequate response to what they had seen. Shard Singer Veltar's official report to the Hegemony High Command captured the stunned reaction of the Confederation's established powers. The human vessel employed tactics that fall outside all recognized parameters of space combat. They demonstrated the ability to manipulate gravitational fields on a planetary scale and weaponize stellar mechanics in ways that our most advanced theorists would have considered impossible. The implications for galactic military balance are disturbing. Section 2, the transformation. The news of the Kepler 438b engagement spread through Confederation space with unprecedented speed, carried not only by official diplomatic channels but by the merchants and traders who had been liberated from the raider threat. The initial reports were met with disbelief, then skepticism, and finally with a growing sense of unease as the evidence became undeniable. The response from the major galactic powers was swift and revealing. The Zephyrian High Command, which had so recently mocked humanity's military capabilities, immediately dispatched a scientific expedition to analyze the remains of the Fortress Moon. The Aquatic Federation recalled 3 of their deep space fleets from exploration duties and redeployed them to defensive positions along their borders with human space. The Silicon Collective began running probability calculations for various scenarios involving human military expansion, all of which produced results they classified as deeply concerning. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the raider organizations themselves. Within days of the battle, no fewer than 7 major raider fleets had approached Confederation authorities seeking amnesty or negotiated surrender. The psychological impact of watching their most successful leader and strongest fortress simply cease to exist had shattered their confidence in the viability of their chosen profession. The transformation in galactic perception of human military capabilities was dramatic, but it was nothing compared to the transformation that had occurred within the man who had orchestrated it. The Marcus Reeves who returned to Terra Station bore little resemblance to the disgraced officer who had been assigned to the Indomitable less than a year earlier. The change was evident not only to his crew but to everyone who encountered him during the journey home. Lieutenant Commander Kim described the phenomenon in her personal log. The captain had always been intense, but after Kepler 438b, there was something different about him. It wasn't arrogance or satisfaction with what we'd accomplished. If anything, he seemed more focused than before, as if the battle had confirmed something he'd already known about himself. It was like watching someone fully inhabit their true nature for the first time. The journey back to Terra Station took 12 days, during which Reeves spent most of his time in what the crew had learned to recognize as his strategic meditation state. But now, instead of analyzing potential future scenarios, he seemed to be processing the implications of what had been accomplished. Dr. Vasquez, who had developed the closest thing to a friendship with Reeves that his personality permitted, later wrote, "Marcus was not celebrating our victory. He was studying it, dissecting every element of the battle to understand not just what had worked, but why it had worked. He was treating the entire engagement as a data point in a much larger pattern he was trying to understand." The pattern Reeves was analyzing would become clear in the weeks and months that followed, as the full implications of the Kepler 438b engagement rippled through galactic civilization. The first indication that something fundamental had changed came during the Indomitable's approach to Terra Station. Standard protocol required incoming vessels to submit to inspection and debriefing by fleet security before being granted docking clearance. The Indomitable's request was processed with unusual speed, and they found themselves assigned to the priority docking bay normally reserved for flag officers and diplomatic vessels. More significantly, their arrival was met by Admiral Harrison himself, accompanied by a full staff of senior officers and technical specialists. This was unprecedented for the return of a single cruiser from what had officially been a reconnaissance mission. The debriefing that followed lasted for 6 days and involved not only Terran Defense Force personnel, but representatives from the Confederation Intelligence Service and several allied governments. Every aspect of the battle was analyzed in exhaustive detail, from the initial sensor sweeps to the final gravitational collapse of the Fortress Moon. The technical analysis proved almost as disturbing to military orthodoxy as the battle itself had been. The gravitational resonance devices that Reeves had used were based on existing technology, but their application represented a conceptual breakthrough that no previous military theorist had considered. The ability to weaponize stellar mechanics opened possibilities for warfare on scales that had previously existed only in theoretical physics. More troubling was the realization that the technology was not particularly exotic. The fundamental principles could be reproduced by any civilization with access to gravitational manipulation technology, which included all of the Confederation's major powers. The barrier had not been technological, it had been conceptual. No one had thought in terms of warfare on such a massive scale because no one had possessed the tactical imagination to conceive of such operations. Elena Vasquez's technical report to Fleet Command concluded, "Commander Reeves has demonstrated that our understanding of space combat has been fundamentally limited by our assumptions about scale and scope. His approach to the Kepler 438b engagement represents not an evolution of existing tactics but a complete paradigm shift in military thinking. The implications extend far beyond this single battle." The strategic analysis was even more sobering. Admiral Harrison's staff had spent years developing contingency plans for various raider threats, all of which had assumed the necessity of large-scale fleet deployments and extended campaigns. Reeves had eliminated the most dangerous raider organization in the galaxy using a single ship and a crew of 73 people in less than 18 minutes of actual combat. The efficiency was staggering, but more importantly, it suggested capabilities that could be scaled up to address much larger threats. If a single human commander with one outdated ship could eliminate a fortress that had resisted the combined efforts of multiple Confederation fleets, what could humanity accomplish with dedicated resources and proper support? This question was being asked not only by human military planners, but by intelligence services throughout the galaxy. The Zephyrian analysis, later obtained through diplomatic channels, concluded, "The humans have demonstrated tactical capabilities that suggest either access to previously unknown technology or cognitive approaches to warfare that exceed our current understanding. Either possibility represents a potential threat to existing power structures that must be addressed with extreme urgency." The response from Terran Defense Command was swift and decisive. Within a week of the debriefing's completion, Reeves found himself promoted to the rank of Admiral and appointed to head a new division, Strategic Systems Command. His mandate was simple in concept, but revolutionary in implications. Develop new approaches to large-scale combat that could leverage humanity's apparent advantages in tactical innovation. More importantly, he was given unprecedented authority to recruit personnel and requisition resources based entirely on his own assessment of requirements. This represented a dramatic departure from normal TDF procedures, which typically involved extensive bureaucratic review of all significant decisions. Admiral Chen, who served as Reeves' liaison with Fleet Command during this period, later wrote, "The brass were honestly terrified of what Marcus had accomplished at Kepler 438. But not because they feared him, though some probably should have, but because they realized that if one human commander could achieve such results, then our enemies could potentially do the same. The only logical response was to ensure that we remained ahead of any potential arms race in strategic innovation." The crew of the Indomitable found themselves at the center of this new paradigm. Rather than being reassigned to other vessels, they were retained as the core personnel for Strategic Systems Command. Their experience with Reeves's unconventional training methods and tactical approaches made them uniquely valuable for developing and testing new concepts. Lieutenant Commander Kim was promoted to captain, and given command of the new Strategic Systems Command training facility. Her mission was to develop methods for identifying and cultivating the kind of tactical thinking that Reeves had demonstrated. Chief Engineer Santos became head of strategic technology development, responsible for finding new applications for existing technology that could be employed in unconventional warfare. Vasquez was appointed director of strategic analysis, tasked with developing theoretical frameworks that could support the kind of large-scale tactical planning that Reeves had employed. Her first project was a comprehensive study of stellar mechanics and their potential military applications. But the most significant appointment was Reeves himself. His new role as head of Strategic Systems Command came with responsibilities that extended far beyond military planning. He was effectively being asked to reimagine humanity's approach to galactic relations, using the capabilities he had demonstrated as leverage for achieving strategic objectives that had previously been considered unattainable. The transformation of human military doctrine began immediately. Traditional approaches to space combat, which emphasized numerical superiority and technological advancement, were supplemented by what became known as Reeves' doctrine, the systematic application of environmental factors and physical laws as force multipliers. Training programs were established to identify officers with the cognitive flexibility necessary for large-scale tactical thinking. These programs were based on the methods Reeves had developed aboard the Indomitable, but refined and systematized for broader application. The selection criteria were revealing. Traditional military virtues like courage, loyalty, and discipline remained important, but they were supplemented by requirements for creative thinking, systems analysis, and what Reeves termed conceptual audacity, the willingness to consider approaches that conventional wisdom would reject as impossible. The first class of Strategic Systems Command officers graduated 6 months after the Kepler 438b engagement. These 37 individuals, drawn from all branches of the Terran Defense Force, represented a new breed of military thinker. They had been trained not only in conventional combat operations, but in physics, engineering, psychology, and what Reeves called strategic philosophy, the art of thinking about problems in ways that transcended traditional limitations. Their first assignment was to analyze potential applications of the gravitational manipulation techniques that had been employed at Kepler 438b. The results were both impressive and alarming. Captain Sarah Kim's team identified 17 different ways that gravitational fields could be weaponized, ranging from the creation of artificial asteroid storms to the development of gravitational weapons that could crush enemy ships without requiring direct contact. Lieutenant Commander Santos's group developed plans for using stellar mechanics to create defensive barriers that would be virtually impenetrable by conventional forces. Dr. Vasquez's theoretical analysis suggested even more exotic possibilities. Her team had identified methods for using gravitational manipulation to disrupt faster-than-light travel, effectively trapping enemy fleets in normal space where they could be engaged at leisure. More dramatically, they had developed preliminary concepts for using gravitational lensing to focus stellar energy into weapons of unprecedented destructive power. But perhaps the most significant development was the psychological impact of these new capabilities on human military thinking. The success at Kepler 438b had demonstrated that limitations which had previously been accepted as fundamental were actually just failures of imagination. This realization had triggered a renaissance in tactical creativity that was producing innovations across all areas of military science. The transformation was not limited to technical capabilities. The confidence that came from demonstrating superiority over previously dominant powers was changing humanity's entire approach to galactic relations. Diplomatic initiatives that had previously been conducted from positions of weakness were now being undertaken with the assurance that came from possessing decisive military advantages. The first test of this new confidence came when the Aquatic Federation attempted to impose new restrictions on human trade routes through their territory. The Federation had historically used their control of certain hyperspace lanes to extract economic concessions from less powerful civilizations. Their attempt to apply this strategy to humanity was met with a response that shocked the galactic community. Rather than engaging in the usual diplomatic negotiations, humanity simply announced that they would no longer recognize Aquatic Federation claims to disputed hyperspace lanes. When Federation forces moved to enforce their territorial claims, they found themselves facing a human fleet employing tactics that made their numerical superiority irrelevant. The engagement, which became known as the Trident Incident, lasted less than 4 hours. Human forces, led by one of Reeves's newly trained protégés, used gravitational manipulation to create artificial hyperspace anomalies that scattered the Federation fleet across three-star systems. The Federation forces suffered no casualties. They simply found themselves stranded in locations where their weapons and numbers were meaningless. The psychological impact was devastating. The Aquatic Federation, which had dominated hyperspace navigation for centuries, discovered that their strategic advantages could be neutralized by opponents with sufficient tactical creativity. They withdrew their territorial claims within days and opened negotiations for a comprehensive trade agreement that granted humanity unprecedented access to their transportation networks. Similar incidents occurred with other galactic powers as they tested humanity's new capabilities and found themselves consistently outmaneuvered. The pattern was always the same. Conventional approaches to conflict were met with innovations that transcended traditional limitations. The Silicon Collective's attempt to use their computational advantages to predict and counter human tactical innovations was defeated when human commanders began employing deliberately irrational decision-making processes that made their actions unpredictable to logical analysis. The Zephyrian effort to neutralize human advantages through superior numbers was countered by tactics that used environmental factors to make numerical superiority irrelevant. Within 2 years of the Kepler 438b engagement, humanity had gone from being the Confederation's least respected military power to being its most feared. The transformation was so complete that former adversaries were actively seeking alliance agreements rather than risk finding themselves in opposition to human strategic capabilities. But the most profound transformation was in Marcus Reeves himself. The man who had once been court-martialed for excessive initiative was now recognized as one of the premier strategic minds in the galaxy. His approaches to warfare had been studied and imitated by military academies throughout Confederation space, though with limited success. Most civilizations lacked the cultural background necessary to think in terms of the kind of radical, tactical innovations that had become standard human practice. The personal cost of this transformation was significant. The intense mental discipline required for large-scale strategic thinking had isolated Reeves from normal human relationships. He had become something like a living computer, capable of analyzing incredibly complex scenarios and formulating solutions that transcended conventional limitations, but increasingly disconnected from the emotional and social aspects of human experience. Vasquez, who remained one of the few people capable of meaningful conversation with him, observed, Marcus had achieved something that most people would consider the ultimate military success. He had transformed himself into the perfect strategic weapon, but in doing so, he had sacrificed much of what makes us human. The question was whether the trade-off was worth it, not just for him personally, but for humanity as a whole. This question would be answered during the crisis that became known as the Void War, when humanity faced the greatest threat in galactic history and discovered that their transformation from weakness to strength was only the beginning of their journey. Session 3. The Crucible. The threat that would test humanity's transformation emerged from the galactic void itself, the vast empty spaces between spiral arms where no stars burned and no civilizations had ever taken root. For millennia, the void had been considered empty, a region of space so devoid of resources and strategic value that no galactic power had bothered to explore it systematically. This assumption proved to be catastrophically wrong. The first indication that something was stirring in the void came from deep space monitoring stations that detected massive gravitational anomalies in regions that should have contained nothing but empty space. These anomalies were initially dismissed as instrumental errors or previously unknown astronomical phenomena. The possibility that they represented artificial constructs created by an unknown civilization was considered so unlikely as to be unworthy of serious investigation. This complacency ended when the monitoring station at Outpost Zebra, positioned at the edge of the galactic disk, transmitted a final message that changed everything. Massive artificial structures approaching from void. Configuration unknown. Energy signatures off scale. They're bigger than we thought possible. The transmission cut off abruptly, and all subsequent attempts to re-establish communication failed. When a Confederation scout ship reached Outpost Zebra's last known position 3 days later, they found nothing but dispersed atomic particles and residual energy signatures that suggested the station had been disintegrated by forces beyond current scientific understanding. More disturbing were the traces of exotic matter that sensors detected in the area, elements that didn't appear on any known periodic table, and energy patterns that violated several supposedly fundamental laws of physics. Whatever had destroyed Outpost Zebra possessed technology that transcended the scientific understanding of all known civilizations. The Confederation Council's response was swift but inadequate. Emergency sessions were convened, military forces were placed on high alert, and diplomatic channels were activated in an attempt to establish communication with whoever or whatever had emerged from the void. The assumption was that this represented a first contact situation with a previously unknown civilization, and that peaceful resolution was both possible and preferable. This assumption was shattered when the second contact occurred. The crystalline hegemony mining operation at Kepler 452c was humanity's former triumph site, now converted into a memorial and research facility. The irony was not lost on anyone when this symbol of human tactical innovation became the target of the Void Dwellers' second assault. The attack, when it came, was recorded by automated systems that had been installed to monitor gravitational anomalies in the system. The recordings revealed the true scope of the threat facing galactic civilization. The enemy vessels, if they could be called vessels, were unlike anything in the Confederation's experience. Each construct was larger than a small moon, composed of materials that seemed to absorb and redirect energy rather than reflecting it. They moved without any visible propulsion system, apparently manipulating space-time itself to achieve acceleration that should have been impossible under known physics. More terrifying was their method of attack. Rather than using conventional weapons, the Void constructs simply unmade their targets. Matter was not destroyed. It was converted into something else, something that ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The mining operation, the memorial facilities, even the asteroids and debris left over from the battle that had made Reeves famous, all simply stopped being. The recordings ended when the monitoring equipment itself was caught in whatever field the constructs projected. The final images showed reality itself seeming to unravel as fundamental particles lost cohesion and dissolved into something that defied classification. The Confederation's response to this second attack was characterized by panic and confusion. Emergency fleets were assembled and deployed to establish defensive perimeters around critical systems, but no one had any idea how to fight an enemy that could apparently erase matter from existence. Traditional military doctrine was useless against opponents who didn't follow the rules of physics that all previous warfare had been based upon. Weapons that depended on energy projection were ineffective against targets that absorbed and redirected energy. Kinetic weapons were meaningless against enemies that could make matter cease to exist. The panic was compounded by the discovery that the Void Dwellers were not a single force, but rather the vanguard of something much larger. Deep space sensors were detecting massive gravitational signatures throughout the void regions, suggesting that an entire civilization was emerging from the empty spaces between the stars. Intelligence estimates suggested that the enemy force consisted of thousands, possibly tens of thousands, of the massive constructs. Each was apparently capable of destroying entire star systems, and they were moving toward inhabited space with relentless purpose. Facing annihilation on a galactic scale, the Confederation Council took an unprecedented step. They formally requested assistance from the Terran Strategic Systems Command, effectively acknowledging humanity as the Confederation's premier military power and placing the defense of galactic civilization in human hands. The request reached Admiral Marcus Reeves at his headquarters on Luna, where he had been conducting advanced research into applications of gravitational manipulation. The message was delivered by Ambassador HFY War himself, the same Zephyrian who had once mocked humanity as soft pink creatures unsuited for warfare. The ambassador's demeanor had changed dramatically. Gone was the condescending arrogance that had characterized previous diplomatic contacts. In its place was a desperation that would have been pathetic if the circumstances had been less dire. Admiral Reeves, the translated message conveyed. The Confederation Council formally requests that the Terran Strategic Systems Command assume coordination of all military responses to the Void threat. We offer unlimited resources and complete operational authority. Our previous assessments of human capabilities were inadequate. We require your tactical innovations to address a threat that transcends conventional military solution. Reeves' response was characteristically calm and direct. I will review the available intelligence and formulate a response. Prepare your fleets for deployment according to specifications that will be provided within 72 hours. What Reeves didn't mention was that he had been tracking the Void threat for weeks through intelligence channels and had already begun developing countermeasures. The gravitational anomalies that had announced the enemy's presence had been detected by human monitoring systems well before the Confederation had recognized their significance. More importantly, the destruction of Outpost Zebra and the Kepler 452c facilities had provided valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and tactical approaches. While the Confederation saw only devastating attacks by incomprehensible forces, Reeves saw patterns and limitations that could be exploited. The key insight came from Dr. Vasquez's analysis of the exotic matter traces left behind by the enemy attacks. The particles that had been dismissed as unknown elements were actually familiar matter that had been subjected to dimensional manipulation, twisted into configurations that allowed them to exist partially outside normal spacetime. "They're not violating the laws of physics," Vasquez explained during the emergency strategy session that convened immediately after the Confederation's request for assistance. "They're using physics we don't understand yet. The matter isn't being destroyed. It's being displaced into dimensions we can't perceive. If we can understand the mechanism, we might be able to reverse it." This revelation transformed the entire strategic picture. The Void Dwellers were not gods wielding impossible powers. They were simply a civilization that had advanced beyond the three-dimensional limitations that constrained everyone else's thinking. Their advantages were overwhelming but not absolute. They could be countered by opponents who understood the principles they were employing. The problem was developing such understanding quickly enough to matter. The void constructs were advancing through space at a rate that would bring them into contact with the first inhabited systems within 6 months. Traditional research and development timelines would require years to produce viable countermeasures. This was exactly the kind of seemingly impossible challenge that Reeves had been preparing for since his transformation aboard the Indomitable. The solution required thinking beyond conventional limitations and applying resources in ways that no previous military commander had considered. The plan that emerged from Strategic Systems Command over the following 72 hours was audacious even by the standards that humanity had established since Kepler 438b. Rather than attempting to match the enemy's dimensional manipulation technology, Reeves proposed to weaponize the fundamental structure of reality itself. The theoretical foundation was based on Dr. Vasquez's research into gravitational lensing and stellar mechanics. If the enemy's advantage came from their ability to manipulate higher dimensions, then the counter-strategy was to deny them access to those dimensions by creating regions of space where dimensional manipulation would be impossible. The technology required would be an extension of the gravitational resonance devices that had been used to such devastating effect against the Raiders. Instead of disrupting gravitational fields, the new devices would create what Reeves termed dimensional anchors, zones of space-time so stable that matter within them could not be displaced into other dimensions. The engineering challenges were staggering. Creating dimensional stability over areas large enough to be tactically significant would require energy expenditures on the scale of stellar output. More problematically, the effect would need to be precisely controlled. Too little stability and the enemy could simply move around the anchored zones. Too much, and the anchors themselves would create gravitational anomalies that would tear apart any ships operating near them. The solution required cooperation on a scale never before attempted in galactic history. Every major civilization would need to contribute not only their military forces, but their most advanced technology and their greatest scientific minds. More importantly, they would need to place all of these resources under the command of Human Strategic Systems Command, effectively acknowledging humanity's leadership in the most crucial conflict in galactic history. The Confederation Council's agreement to these terms represented a complete reversal of the power structures that had governed galactic civilization for millennia. Civilizations that had viewed humanity as primitive and irrelevant just 3 years earlier were now placing their survival in human hands. The massive industrial mobilization that followed dwarfed anything in recorded history. Entire star systems were converted into manufacturing centers dedicated to producing the components required for Reeves' dimensional anchors. The Zephyrian industrial complexes at Vega, the Aquatic Federation's deep space factories, the Silicon Collective's automated production facilities, all were retooled to support the human strategic plan. More significantly, the greatest scientific minds in the galaxy were brought together in research teams directed by Human Strategic Systems Command officers. The cultural barriers and professional jealousies that had previously prevented such cooperation were swept aside by the urgency of the threat. Dr. Vasquez found herself directing a team that included the collective's most advanced artificial intelligences, the Federation's leading experts in exotic physics, and the hegemony's foremost specialists in crystalline energy manipulation. The combination of different cognitive approaches and technological capabilities produced innovations that no single civilization could have achieved alone. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Reeves's newly trained strategic officers, Commander Eleanor Torres, identified a flaw in the enemy's dimensional manipulation that could be exploited. The Void construct's ability to displace matter into higher dimensions required tremendous energy expenditure to maintain stability across dimensional boundaries. If that stability could be disrupted at a critical moment, the displaced matter would snap back into normal spacetime with devastating force. This insight led to the development of what became known as dimensional recoil weapons. Devices that could cause enemy constructs to effectively destroy themselves by losing control of their own displaced matter. The weapons were relatively simple in concept but required precise timing and coordination to be effective. The first test of human strategy came when the Void advance forces reached the Outer Rim systems. Rather than attempting to defend these positions, Reeves ordered a complete evacuation and established his first dimensional anchor at the Rigel system, directly in the path of the enemy advance. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded military history. The Void constructs, encountering regions of space where their dimensional manipulation abilities were useless, found themselves forced to operate under the same physical limitations that constrained conventional forces. Their massive size, which had been an overwhelming advantage when they could simply unmake opposing forces, became a liability when they had to rely on conventional physics. Human fleets, operating in perfect coordination with allied forces from across the galaxy, engaged the enemy using tactics that had been refined during months of intensive preparation. The dimensional recoil weapons proved devastatingly effective, causing several of the massive constructs to tear themselves apart as their own displaced matter returned to normal spacetime uncontrolled. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that the Void dwellers were not invincible. They could be hurt, they could be confused, and they could be defeated by opponents who understood their capabilities and limitations. But the victory at Rigel was only the beginning of a conflict that would span the entire galaxy and test every aspect of humanity's transformation from weakness to strength. The Void civilization's response to their first military defeat was swift and terrifying. Rather than retreating or attempting to negotiate, they accelerated their advance and began employing tactics that suggested a level of strategic sophistication that matched their technological advantages. The constructs began operating in coordinated groups that could overwhelm dimensional anchors through sheer force of numbers. They developed countermeasures to dimensional recoil weapons that limited their effectiveness. Most disturbingly, they began targeting the industrial facilities that were producing human equipment, suggesting an understanding of galactic economics and supply chains. The conflict escalated into a running battle that consumed entire star systems. Humanity's tactical innovations were matched by enemy adaptations, creating an arms race in strategic thinking that pushed both sides to their limits. The turning point came when Reeves made a decision that shocked even his closest associates. Rather than continuing the defensive campaign, he proposed to take the war directly to the enemy's stronghold in the Void itself. The plan was technically feasible but strategically insane. It would require the combined fleets of every galactic civilization to venture into regions of space where no stars burned and no navigation references existed. They would be operating at the extreme range of their supply lines against enemies fighting on their home ground. More problematically, the Void environment itself was hostile to conventional technology. The exotic physics that the enemy employed were apparently natural phenomena in the regions between spiral arms. Human forces would find their equipment functioning unpredictably, while their enemies operated at peak efficiency. The decision to proceed with what became known as the Void campaign represented the ultimate test of the philosophy that had driven Reeves' transformation. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. The weak self that had to be destroyed was not personal but civilizational. The assumption that galactic powers were limited to operating within the familiar regions of space where physics behaved predictably. If humanity could adapt to fighting in environments that transcended conventional limitations, they could achieve victory that would be impossible through traditional approaches. The Void campaign lasted 8 months and involved battles on scales that had never been imagined. Fleets numbering in the thousands of ships engaged enemies whose very existence challenged understanding of reality. Victory was measured not in territory captured, but in enemy capabilities eliminated. The final battle took place at the Void civilization's central construct, a structure so massive that it possessed its own gravitational field and supported what appeared to be an entire ecosystem of exotic matter. The assault required every tactical innovation that humanity had developed, plus several that were invented during the battle itself. The climax came when Reeves, operating from the command ship positioned at the center of the combined galactic fleet, implemented a strategy that no one else would have considered. He used the dimensional anchor technology to stabilize a region of space around the enemy construct, then triggered a dimensional recoil effect that caused the entire structure to collapse into normal space-time. The result was the creation of a new star, a brilliant point of light that would burn for billions of years, marking the location where the greatest threat in galactic history had been turned into a source of energy and life. The victory was complete and total. The void civilization, deprived of their central construct and their dimensional manipulation advantages, ceased to exist as a unified force. The surviving constructs scattered throughout the void, no longer a threat to galactic civilization. But the true victory was not military, it was psychological and cultural. The galaxy had faced annihilation and had survived through the leadership of a species that had been mocked and dismissed just a few years earlier. The transformation was complete. Humanity had evolved from the Confederation's weakest member to its undisputed leader. Marcus Reeves himself had undergone the most profound transformation of all. The man who had once been court-martialed for excessive initiative was now recognized as the savior of galactic civilization. The weak self that had doubted and limited him had been completely destroyed, replaced by something that transcended normal human limitations while remaining essentially human. In his final log entry before retiring from active service, Reeves wrote, "The greatest enemy we face is never external. It is the part of ourselves that accepts limitation as inevitable and impossibility as absolute. When we destroy that weak self and embrace what we can become, no force in the universe can ultimately defeat us." The transformation was complete, but it was also permanent. Humanity had not merely won a war. They had redefined what was possible in warfare itself. The weak species that had once sought diplomatic solutions to every problem had become the civilization that others looked to when diplomacy failed and survival was at stake. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. In proving this philosophy on the ultimate battlefield, Marcus Reeves and humanity had established their position not just as warriors, but as the guardians of civilization itself against threats that transcended conventional understanding. The galaxy would never be the same. Neither would humanity. And that perhaps was the point. EPI. Classified Addendum. Personal note from Admiral Sarah Chen. The events recorded in this document fundamentally altered not only humanity's position in galactic affairs, but our understanding of our own potential. Marcus Reeves' transformation from a disgraced officer to the architect of galactic salvation serves as both historical record and philosophical statement about the nature of human capability. The man who reported to the Indomitable as a broken commander was not rebuilt. He was reforged into something that transcended his previous limitations while remaining recognizably human. His journey from mockery to victory demonstrates that our greatest limitations are often self-imposed, maintained by assumptions about what is possible rather than inherent restrictions on what we can achieve. The tactical innovations that emerged from Strategic Systems Command continue to influence military doctrine throughout the galaxy. The concept of environmental warfare, the weaponization of physics itself, and the systematic destruction of conceptual limitations have become standard elements of strategic thinking. Perhaps more importantly, the psychological transformation that allowed these innovations has spread throughout human civilization. We no longer see ourselves as junior partners in galactic affairs, seeking acceptance from more established powers. We have become the standard by which strategic capability is measured. The cost of this transformation was significant. Marcus Reeves never fully returned to normal human relationships after the Void War. It became something like a living symbol of human potential, inspiring but isolated, capable of tremendous achievement but disconnected from the simple human connections that give life meaning. Whether this trade-off was worth it remains a matter of debate among military philosophers. What is undeniable is that without Reeves's willingness to sacrifice his comfortable limitations and become something unprecedented, galactic civilization would have perished in the void between the stars. The document concludes here, but the story continues. Every human who chooses to destroy their weak self and embrace their potential carries forward the legacy of the man who bleached the battlefield at Kepler 438b and saved the galaxy from extinction. The transformation is available to anyone willing to pay the price of leaving their limitations behind.